Ja, en dan gaan 'n paar oop stoel. Hello, everybody. Grab a seat, make yourself comfortable. Those who only got half a muffin before I chased you all in here, there'll be more muffins at tea time. So if you can hold out till tea time. We're going to start proceedings. The rector of the university will be arriving soon. He's just running a little bit late because there's another forum that he has to also welcome people to. But it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Edward Charles Hyman, who is the Festival First Nation Ambassador, Khoisan leader in the Free State, and also on the Griqua Council of the Free State. Charles, dankie. And hashtag PIAD 18, because you'll see the Twitter stream go up here. So we are being live streamed across the world. I think there's about 30 to 50,000 people in the US who might be watching because we're going through a US live streaming channel. And they're all going to be joining in hashtag PIAD 18. So please tweet your ideas, thoughts, everything. And now to Charles. Thank you, Charles.
Oh, gee. Oh, thank you. Morning, everybody. My name is Edward Charles Hyman. I'm the First Nations Ambassador. And this morning I want to start with Kaitres. Kaitrego, are you fine? Oh, yes. Seems like everybody's fine. I acknowledge the leadership of Captain Johannes Kraushoek and the various Korana leaders from the province. I also acknowledge the Khoi and San leadership in South Africa and the ancestors of the Khoi and San and those who passed on, such as Reverend Mario Mahongo, David Kruiper and Raymond Sedi. Sidat as we believe. The First Nations of South Africa, the Khoi and San, lived in spiritual unity without hate, envy, or borders of classification. After 300 years of colonialism and 40 years of apartheid regime, a new dispensation arrived with the release of Nelson Mandela and thus led to the democratic elections in 1994. In 2001, the various Khoi and San groups included the three major San groups, the Tum, the Kumani, and the Twe, the Griqua, the Cape Khoi, the Korana, and the Nama. They came together in Oudtshoorn under one unity. Tareda, Kaige, Sida Setia, meaning our strength is in who we are. It was also at that same gathering that Deputy President Mr. Jacob Zuma, who was then the Deputy President, praises the bravery of Atsumatsu and how he inspired the leaders whilst they were imprisoned in Robben Island. For those of you who doesn't know Atsumatsu was, as the people have given him the funny name, Harry die Strandloper. But that was his real name. He was also the first prisoner from Robben Island. After that, in 2002, Tata Madiba acknowledges his Khoi ancestry. And so too, that Mr. Mbeki also said his famous poem, I am an African. I owe my beings to the Khoi and the San. Now, in providing the platform, the First Nations, for the First Nations of South Africa, artists, especially the artists, the Free State Festival started the process of recognizing the Khoi and the San and the First Nations, and to build solidarity amongst them and with the rest of the world. As this edition of the Free State Art Festival unfolds, our First Nation project recognize and appreciate deepens an understanding of unity and diversity. We had our second colloquium last year, and we had a clear understanding and a vision as to say where we go and what we want to do. So, on behalf of my ancestors, on behalf of my leaders, I would like to welcome you to Bloemfontein, to the land of the Korana, the Griqua, the Khoi, the San. And I want to say to you, Gan Tri, Ko Trati, Tielopte, Tielopte. I am First Nation. Tri Gangans. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. So just a warm welcome from the PIAD side as well to the forum. This is our 5th forum, so it's a little bit of a milestone for us. It's the 5th year that PIAD is also running. I was trying to think this morning over a cup of coffee over the last 5 years, and I remember our first year we looked at transformation. In the second year we looked at audience development. The third year was focused on sustainability. The 4th year, which was last year, arts and science, and this year we're looking at diversity. So next year promises to be another exciting year, and we hope to see all of you here too. The Program for Innovation, Artform Development is an arts development initiative focusing on how technology, transdisciplinary research, and experimental art can connect with and impact on communities. It was established in 2014 by the Vrystaat Art Festival and the University of the Free State in response to data indicating that the creative industries in Africa contribute less than 1% to global output. As increased access to and participation in culture can be linked to the increase in human development, the PIAD focuses on supporting cross-cultural experimental art programs that can creatively transform South African society. In 2015, PIAD received significant support from the Andrew Mellon Foundation through a grant made available to the University of the Free State. This long-term support has enabled the program to grow over the last 3 years. PIAD is engaging the skills and expertise of South African artists in collaboration with several international partners who are recognized as global leaders in the field to develop a mutually beneficial program of engagement. PIAD brings to South Africa the development, presentation, and promotion of transdisciplinary and experimental art projects, including the First Nation Project, which is an international First Nations cultural exchange bringing together a series of cross-cultural projects, colloquiums, and artistic practice between peoples of First Nation descent. The project supports First Nation creative works that can be presented at cultural and artistic platforms in South Africa and abroad, starting at the Vrystaat Art Festival. PIAD facilitates art science research and interdisciplinary art residencies at the University of the Free State. The focus is to create transdisciplinary work within the arts, science, and health that addresses social challenges and stimulates innovative art practice and new research methodologies, with the hope to establish South Africa as a global place of interest for innovation and art science research. PIAD facilitates art laboratories for diverse South African creative practitioners. The Arts Laboratory, or Open Lab, is an intensive studio group residency that brings together creative practitioners to develop and interrogate their artistic practice. It is a platform aimed to generate new strategies and ideas in creating experimentally and socially engaged artwork. Artists are mentored, supported, and given the opportunity to develop and present new projects within the Vrystaat Arts Festival setting. PIAD works with South African and international artists to co-produce, present, and promote challenging new work in the city of Bloemfontein, Mangaung. PIAD successively co-produced major projects such as Plastic Histories in 2014, a public art project that investigated the nature and meaning of public monuments and statues in the city, the White Horse Project in 2015, which embraced the contested nature of the symbol of the White Horse of Bloemfontein in hopes of modeling a way to reimagine the past. It's My City in 2016, which served to connect the self-selecting and pre-existing communities from different parts of Bloemfontein, Mangaroon, and resulted in over 5,000 people participating in the project. Onesie World in 2017, which celebrated oneness through fashion and the process of making, moving, and dressing alike. And Air in 2018, a performative poetry book launch and sound walk in the city in an attempt to shift our usual modes of transmission and search for ways in which we can connect on a human level. PIAD facilitates debate through artist talks, lectures, walkabouts, dialogue sessions, and forums to engage critically with artistic practice and social changes. In the long term, it is hoped that PIAD will contribute to the art form innovation, community transformation, and creative industry development in South Africa and eventually Africa. It is hoped PIAD will provide a platform for nurturing African artists and play a pivotal role in developing a community that has a better understanding of and openness to diverse perspectives, experiences, and cultures of others. Thank you.
Prof. Peterson is still on his way, so apologies for that, but Prof will be in conversation with Hassan after Hassan's speech and before tea. I'd like to introduce Hassan Mahamdallie. I met Hassan very recently in London, a good friend of mine and the executive director of the Pan-African Creative Exchange, Nikkei Jonah, took me. I thought I was going for a cup of tea, and then I ended up going to another lecture. And I sat and I heard Hassan talk about diversity and the kind of the impact of bringing very different cultures, languages, abilities together. And the nexus of this, there's kind of this creative engine that is incredibly important for the development of the work. I'm not going to read Hassan's bio to you. It's in the program book. It's long, it's extensive, it's extraordinary. I'd rather us hear from Hassan about his ideas around the creative case for diversity, how we kind of can develop innovation through difference in the arts. Hassan, thank you very much.
Right, good morning everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, good. That's a good start. Okay, let's get going. Oh, a bit cold, so I'm going to warm myself up a bit. I do want to talk about a particular strand of thought that I've been developing along with a whole number of collaborators over, I guess it's the past 5 years. And it's called the Creative Case for Diversity and Equality in the Arts is the long title for it. And it's something that myself and other people have been developing to try and, I guess, make the question of diversity and equality in the central to the question of arts practice, the creative moment, how things, how art innovates itself, how it reaches and talks to contemporary society. And I guess part of the reason for it was to build a platform where everyone could be involved in. So I hope when it comes to question and answer, you all will be involved in extending the conversation. I'm always interested to hear what people have to say and the examples that they bring to the table, because that kind of fleshes the whole thing out even more. It's not really a policy. The Creative Case for Diversity is an extended, multifaceted conversation. And I've got a few slides to show you just to keep you interested along the way. So let's start on this little journey this morning. I want to start with this first slide actually, and just to acknowledge the great visual artist Louise Bourgeois, who came to prominence in the arts world really towards the end of her career. She had a huge extended career as an artist over 70 years, mostly based in New York. But it took till 1982 for her to have her first retrospective in New York at the Museum of Modern Art, whereas all her male contemporaries had retrospectives going back decades and decades. And it's very interesting if you read her talking about her early life as an artist, and she clearly an incredible artist with a lot to give the visual arts world. What she said was this, and I kind of paraphrase. She said, well, you know, I was a young woman in New York in the 1940s and 50s. All these great male artists were throwing these huge exhibitions, you know, from Picasso onwards, being revered at the Museum of Modern Art and being slotted into, if you like, the canon of work of Western visual arts. But I was a young woman. I had small children, and I didn't really like going to parties and getting drunk and whatever it was. All these sort of testosterone-filled male artists. That was the kind of life that they led. So she said I was kind of overlooked. I kept on doing my work. I kept on going to the studio every day, and I was doing my work. And she created this huge body of work, but she was completely overlooked by the New York and Western art scene, basically because she was a young woman who had kids and who didn't quite fit in with the kind of template of the great male artist, which was being encouraged, if you like, through the Museum of Modern Art in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s. And so she only came to prominence later in her life. So for me, when I read that, it kind of gave me, it kind of said to me, there are these structures in the arts upon which only a thin kind of strand of typical artist can kind of perch. But outside of that thin kind of strand of artists, there's clearly a whole plethora, a whole diversity of other artists who do extraordinary work, but who never ever come to national or international prominence. And I think that was true for Louise Bourgeois, and I think it's true today. We accept so much. You know, we read the art journals or we go and see the exhibitions, and today visual arts is dominated by these kind of monster exhibitions of Matisse and Picasso and all these people, and you pay your ticket to go and see them, and people queue up for their half-hour kind of trip through the gallery. So in one sense, that kind of thin canon of work is being kind of deified and reified every single day. But we shouldn't forget this huge canvas of work which lays outside of this small canon of work. And so that was the lesson that she taught me. Now, just a reminiscence, not for the sake of nostalgia, but because it's important to me. In the mid-1980s, I was accepted for a master's degree at the University of Leeds to study theatre studies. And the senior tutor on the theatre studies course at the University of Leeds in that time was a man called Martin Banham, Professor Martin Banham. And he had encouraged for decades before that and after that for playwrights from an African subcontinent to come to the University of Leeds to develop their work and meet other people from across the world. It was a very, very international group of around 20 people who took the MA course every year. And his kind of connection to theatre in Africa went back to the 1950s when he was a student at the same time at the University of Leeds with Wole Sinka. And when I got there in the mid-1980s, I joined this group of international theatre students. And there was one particular person who I found extremely exciting, intriguing, and interesting. And it was this young man who I was on the MA Theatre Studies course with at the University of Leeds, I think it's 1985, 1986. Anyone know who he is? No? Okay. I'll tell you, it's Hassan Mahamdallie, one of the preeminent playwrights in South Africa who emerged out of Soweto, at poor beginnings in Soweto, onto the theatre scene during the apartheid era. And he was brought over by Martin Banham on a scholarship to the University of Leeds, and I spent 9 months with him developing theatre. And the theatre that he came with a suitcase packed full of his plays, of which that's one of the play books, Gangsters and Dirty Work. And his plays were a revelation to me because they united my two passions, which was theatre and politics, and radical politics at that. But he did it in a way which, for me, was completely new. Because coming out of Soweto, the theatre was maybe you might call rough theatre. It had elements of kind of Brechtian aesthetic to it. It was about ordinary people and their struggles. One of the plays I remember was called Umongikazi, the nurse. And I read his scripts and we performed his plays at the University of Leeds. And Hassan Mahamdallie really set me off on a kind of journey into political theatre. If I hadn't met him, I think my course in terms of my development of theatre might have been very different. And when I left the University of Leeds, having gained my MA, I went straight into doing theatre and education and community theatre in the working class communities of the coal mining areas in the north of England. And I decided to kind of dedicate myself to that kind of work, basically because I met Hassan Mahamdallie. And I was always very grateful, in one sense, that this South African playwright had kind of merged into my consciousness, because he made a big difference to me. But to be honest, you know, in the theatre scene in the UK today, there are very, very few contemporary African playwrights who were able to see. And to be honest, when I look at Hassan Mahamdallie, he changed my professional life so much. And it seems a shame to me that people like him who emerge out of a particular milieu, who have so much to offer, are never offered to theatre students in the UK, who continue to be offered Shakespeare, a bit of Ibsen, the kind of European classics, and maybe a sprinkling of American classical playwrights like Arthur Miller and so on and so forth. Again, this huge canvas of voices which we never hear. And so I thought it was important that I marked my kind of relationship with Hassan Mahamdallie. Okay, so let me get on to the creative case for diversity and equality in the arts and try and sketch out for you the kind of basic foundation stones of it. There's going to be a bit of theory and a bit of history in there for you. So I hope it has some resonance for you. And although I'm going to be concentrating on the relationship between issues of racial and ethnic politics, to be honest, the creative case of diversity is much bigger than that and encompasses relationship between disability in art, which I'm extremely interested in, gender, sexuality, and one thing which is coming up in the UK more and more is a relationship between socioeconomics, the working class, if you like, and theatre and art making. So all of those are kind of packed into the creative case for diversity, but I haven't got time, unfortunately, to go through them all. I'm very happy to maybe elaborate during the question and answer. So, What is the creative case for diversity? The creative case for diversity is the official policy for Arts Council England at the moment, and it is being talked about in different forums around the world, which I'm very pleased about. And it's based upon a very simple observation, that diversity in its widest sense, I'm not talking about a kind of category, a policy category, diversity in its widest sense is integral to the artistic process. I put it this way. If there was a chemical formula for the creative act, if there was a way which we could kind of make a formula of it, if there was an X plus Y equals Z, and Z was the creative act, then X would be diversity. For me, and I'm convinced of it, it's that central to the production of art. It's not a marginal question. It's a central element to really how creativity occurs and therefore how art is produced. Diversity, the essence, the element of it, if you like, to use the scientific metaphor, the element of diversity is important because it provides a dynamic that drives art forward, that innovates art. And I think you can't underestimate the relationship between diversity and innovation in arts. And it brings art into profound and transformative dialogue with contemporary society. So my first marker, if you like, my first argument is that diversity in relation to artistic practice is far from being a marginal question. Now, what do we mean by diversity? And I understand that all these terms are contested. Diversity, what does that mean? Equality, what do we mean by equality? And there are other kind of concepts which are beginning to get drawn into the debate, which I'll touch upon later on. The question of decolonisation is a big question which is coming up in, I know it has a particular history and relevance in terms of Africa, but decolonisation is even a concept which is raising its head in the UK and across Western Europe. It may be a slightly different historical context than here, but nonetheless, it's quite a live concept at the moment in terms of the arts and equality. So what do we mean when we talk about diversity? Well, I think the first thing we have to say is, unlike, if you like, the conception of many policymakers who kind of agonize over these questions, is very simple. Diversity exists. We don't have to make it. We don't have to manufacture it. Diversity exists. Diversity is all around us. To talk about diversity is just to express the what is. Diversity is an essential feature of nature, of the natural world, of evolution. It's the motor for evolution. Diversity is an element of adaptation, of development and change. Diversity just is. You don't have to make it, you don't have to worry about it, you don't have to agonize about it. Diversity just is. A lack of diversity, if we take the natural world, for example, the narrowing of the Earth's biodiversity due to despoilation of the environment, particularly by the human species, the Anthropocene age, as it's called, the lack of diversity, or narrowing of diversity, is recognised as threatening the whole future of our planet. So diversity, if you like, just arises out of the real world. We are all diverse in this room in many, 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 many different levels. No, I don't have to conjure up diversity out of you. You all represent so many different types of diversity. In the history of the development of human society, diversity is a moving force. For example, the entrance from the outside of a new idea, a new understanding, a new way of seeing things, what we might call insight in innovation, is the force that allows society to make civilizational leaps forward. Societies that, for whatever reason, cut themselves off from diversity, historically, ultimately turn it in on themselves, stagnate, collapse, and die. And human history has has whole examples of societies that ossify and die because, if you like, they shut out diversity. And there's many, many examples of that which you'll know. So diversity cannot be a problem if it just is a state of things. So many policymakers agonize, I say, over this question of making diversity a problem. It's not a problem. The problem that we face is that we have alienated ourselves from diversity, and we have managed to impose man-made inequalities on our diverse society, and by extension, in terms of our subject area today, on our arts community. So it's not diversity, it's inequality, which is the key thing. Inequality is the man-made, if you like, element. Diversity is just all around us. When we shut ourselves off of diversity because of inequality, because of the shutting out of various influences, people, historical traditions, narratives, and so on and so forth, this is the problem. Diversity is not the problem. Inequality is a problem. The problem that we face, I think, as an arts community, certainly in the West, and I think in other parts of the world as well, unfortunately, is the problem we face is that we have distorted the way in which we view the history and creativity of the arts. We've distorted our practice, we've distorted our critical debate, and we've decided that some artistic practice is more equal than others. Some artistic practice has more intrinsic value and worth than others. That's the kind of hierarchies that we have managed to create for ourselves. We've created artificial hierarchies, as Louis Bourgeois could tell you, but we pretend that's just the way it is. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with arts policymakers where they kind of tell me, you know, it's very interesting, your ideas are very interesting, but when it comes to the great men of art, you can't go there. Don't go there. They kind of warn me, because these things are kind of sacred, and to begin to undermine them or question them or even critique them is almost sacrilegious. So these artificial hierarchies, which have been turned into a what is, or are the things which are beginning to hold us back. We've constructed these canons of important work and subjective value judgments. You know, they tell me objectively, this is a great artist. Objectively, this is a great artist. But really what they're talking to me about is their taste, their constructed values. Every time they talk to me and tell me that something's objective, I look at it and I can see the value judgments which are embedded within it, even if they can't see it. So notions of taste, of quality, of what is excellence, are all bound up in these subjective value judgments, which give an outward show of being objective and unchanging realities, neutral and objective. So this presents us, if you like, with a contradiction which we seemingly can't escape. We have this creative process which is driven by the motor of diversity. We have creation and inspiration, which is almost, by definition, diverse. Dreams and imagination. You know, this is, you know, the bubbling up of thoughts and visions and things like this. You know, this is unfettered. It's a reflection of diversity even within the human psyche, which is a reflection of diversity of the outside world. But we have these structures and ideas and value judgments which narrow and narrow and narrow and narrow the artistic offering, which create exclusive networks of distribution of art, how art is delivered, who consumes the art and under what circumstances, and the production of art, particularly in the UK, is increasingly delivered through a network of exclusivity. In other words, to be honest, in the arts in the UK, and maybe this has resonance for you, it's not how good you are, it's not what you do, it's not the question of your intrinsic value as an artist, it's who you know, who you went to university with, who you could sit around a dinner table with. That's really what gets you on your journey into a career into the arts. And that's increasingly so in the UK. The exclusivity, despite all the rhetoric around diversity and equality, that exclusivity is becoming stronger and stronger and narrower and narrower. So my argument, and the argument about creative cases, is this. If you really care about art, if you are really excited and value the creative moment, if you really want to go beyond paying lip service to innovation, how new genres arise, the relationship between art and contemporary society, the relationship between art and the past and the present and the possibilities for the future. If you're really serious about that, then you have to put diversity in its widest sense and in narrow sense in terms of who you work with, who you commission, who you show in your galleries, who writes your plays, the people who are on your screens or on your stages. You have to take the question of diversity seriously as one of the central factors in the arts. So, in one sense, the provocation for the creative case for diversity is, if you're interested in the arts, you have to be interested in the relationship between diversity and equality in the arts. So, how does that break down in terms of creative case? Firstly, we have to have more equity, more equality in the arts. If we are shutting ourselves off from this broad canvas, we have to have more people in the ring. It's as simple as that. We have to remove the barriers to the arts. I'll give you a very small example. The relationship between women directors or women playwrights and a production of theatre in the UK. I'll take a UK example. You may have others. Now, if you're a young female director, you can begin to make your progression into theatre. But if you're almost immediately locked out of that career progression. Why? Because if you look at the way, it doesn't have to be this way, if you look at the way theatre is made in the UK, you have to have these usually short, intensive rehearsal periods, where everyone has to learn their lines, everything has to be blocked, the production, all the technicals have to be done within 2 or 3 weeks maybe, right? You maybe work 11, 12, 15 hours a day. Then when the production is due to go up, you have 12, 15-hour technical rehearsals and then dress rehearsals and whatever. Then you have to go on a tour, which may be a 6-week tour or a 3-month tour, a year tour, where you have to tour nationally or increasingly internationally. Now, if you're a woman and you're burdened within your family, being the principal child carer, you are squeezed out of that process also almost immediately. Now, to be honest, theatre doesn't have to be made in that way, but it is made in that way, and it favours men over women. It's quite simple, particularly women who decide to have children. So we need more equality in the arts. And we've got a long way to go, I think, before we could confidently say that everyone has an equal chance to make their way in the arts. We've got a long, long, long way to go. And it always amuses me that people tell me, yes, we've got a long way to go, so it's going to take maybe 4 generations. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm nearly 60. 4 generations? What the hell? Come on. Does change always have to be this slow? Does it always have to be incremental? And the one thing that I've learned is this, is that incremental progress towards equality in the arts is an invisible goal. To be honest, if you want to make change, you have to make radical, thoroughgoing, from the roots change. The little bits here and there really, at the end of the day, don't get you anywhere. My metaphor is it's like a snail in the sun. You know, it gets about a foot and then it dries up, and that's the end of it. That's what incremental evolutionary progress in the arts looks like. A snail in the sun, you know? And who wants to be the snail in the sun, you know? Or even depend, or even follow the trail of the snail in the sun. No, we have to have much more revolutionary change in the arts to say that we're anywhere near achieving any kind of equality. The second thing that we need to have is a recognition and a re-recognition of who's important in the arts. There has to be a new conversation that attempts through various means, and a creative case is hopefully one of them, to resituate what I call diverse artists, which is a horrible, clunky term, but I hope you kind of know what I mean. Both historically and theoretically at the centre of the arts. Why should it take Louise Bourgeois into her 70th year before she gets recognition as being a foremost visual artist within the Western canon, if you like? Why should it take so long for artists from diverse or disadvantaged backgrounds to have their say, as it were, and have access to opportunities and resources? Historically, we need to rewrite our history. And this is where the decolonial movement comes in. In the UK, the decolonial movement, although it started in the UK, inspired by the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, very quickly the decolonisation of the arts movement in the UK has been about trying to, one, dismantle structures of which they see as being unequal, but secondly, to say, you know what, we need to relook at the curriculum. We need to relook at what we're teaching in drama schools. We need to relook at the whole way that the visual arts is taught. We have to relook at the nature of dance training. We have to relook at the music conservatoires and revisit, if you like, all these historical figures to see whether, that we don't just take them for granted that they're great or whatever it might be. Who are we missing? Who needs to be brought into focus? And can we have a more thoughtful and critiqueful look at the curriculums? So that's beginning to happen at the moment. And then thirdly, we need a new vision. We need a new framework for looking at artistic production in the whole. We need to take out this negative framework, the negative framework that says, you know, if you're a black artist or a woman artist, whatever it is, you can have a little piece of the pie. You can maybe, wait for everyone else to finish the meal and you get what's left. We need to take things out that, in one sense, also the notion that the progress towards equality is burdensome, that it's just an effort. It's like this Herculean effort that if you're a good person with a good heart beating in your chest and you love black people or you love women or you love disabled people and you're so upset that they don't get a shout, we have to trash all that, get all that off the table, right? And we have to say, actually, let's have a conversation about art. And we could all have that conversation. So we need a kind of new framework. Now, what kind of frameworks did I look at when I was developing the creative case for diversity? One of the frameworks I looked at was this notion, this concept of standpoint theory. Anyone heard of the standpoint theory? Okay, it was developed by radical feminists in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. And what it basically said is that social groups within which we are located powerfully shape what we experience and know, as well as understand and articulate about the world. And it's based on the work of social anthropologists, particularly people like Franz Boas from Columbia University, high five, Ruth Benedict and Pierre Bourdieu. And these people, what they tried to do was they tried to, if you like, de-center the dominant narratives and conversations and say, okay, that's the center. But what if the centre was here? What if the centre was there? What really the centre of innovation in the arts is not here in the middle, but it's here on the so-called periphery, or on the outside, or in the unexpected place, or the place that we don't look at or we don't value, or the people we don't look at because we don't value them. So it was a standpoint theory. If you look at it, says that basically, if you're at the center, and therefore, in one sense, if you occupy the center and you occupy the power which goes with being at the center, you don't really need to look outwards. You don't really need to see what's going on, in one sense, because you think that because you're the kind of, it's like a centrifuge. If you're at the center, then everything good will eventually come to you anyway. And if I look at, for example, our national institutions of the arts in the UK, they just sit there, they squat there like this strange animal, and they just wait for the innovation to gradually make its way to them. And in the process of the innovation gradually making its way to the centre, it becomes less and less vital. You know, it kind of gets its teeth pulled until it's rather a shallow version of what it was when it first sparked into life. But if you are forced, and some people make I kind of do, make a virtue of it. If you're forced to live at the margins, what do you do at the margins? To be honest, you are forever scanning. You're forever looking for people to work with. You're forever, because you don't have resources, you're always looking to people who you could collaborate with on a kind of artistic barter system. You know, you lend me 2 hours in your studio, down the line, I'll sing a backing track for you, whatever it might be. You know, you let me have your rehearsal room, or tell me who's a good actor who could do this role, and down the line, I'll do another favour for you. If you're in the centre, you just buy it all in. It's just a transaction for you. But at the margins, to be honest, it's a much more vital process. Actually, the bartering process, the notion of trying to say, look, I've got something, can you help me? Or I need something, can you help me? Or I can give you this, whatever it is an act of communication. It's not an act of financial transaction where you're just buying in talent, as the phrase goes. Right? So actually, if you do exist on this so-called margin, to be honest, you're always scanning. You're always looking around. In one sense, you have to just to survive. But I see that as being a very creative, dynamic way of going about things. So you'll always find, in whatever walk of life, not just the arts, that the people who have less generate more. They just have to, as a state of living or existence or whatever it might be. You know, people talk to me about leadership, right? I would say that the African Caribbean woman living 15 floors up in a block of flats in the middle of London, trying to feed a family on £50 a week or whatever her benefits are, and trying to get them dressed and go to school and get an education and whatever it might be. That woman is a leader. But who acknowledges her? Who acknowledges her? But every day, she leads, she creates something out of nothing. She bestows her energy onto her children, whatever it might be. She budgets in a way that the rich don't have to even worry about how much is coming out of their credit card. She's an incredible innovator. She's an incredible leader. But do we value her in society? Do we value her equivalent in the arts? No, we don't. But for me, those people for me are the real leaders. So that's the standpoint theory, which, if you like, and what I like to do in some of these conversations about the arts, I like to turn the accepted values on their head. So I like to turn the periphery into the centre, and the centre into the periphery, and see where that takes me. And, you know, because if you accept the status quo, then, to be honest, there's not much of an argument, really. It is really a peripheral argument around the edges. But if you turn the whole thing upside down, then I think you're beginning to make intellectual and artistic headway. Now, to look at a historical period that I found useful in terms of researching the creative case of diversity. Funnily enough, I was in New York at an arts convention, and I bought a book at a bookshop about the Harlem Renaissance. Because I thought, I don't really know much about the Harlem Renaissance, really. So I bought this, and you can't get decent books about the Harlem Renaissance in London. But there was a very, very good book about the Harlem Renaissance in a bookshop in New York, and I picked it up and I started to read it. And then I thought, this is extraordinary. Now, this is an extraordinary period. It can teach me something. The Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual, a social, and a creative explosion that took place in Harlem, the poorest area of New York at the time, spanning the 1920s and the 1930s, and its influence went on throughout the 20th century in terms of America. Some people will know this story, so forgive me. But one thing I tried to struggle with was this. If you think about the Harlem Renaissance, that group of African Americans who kind of came up from the South into the Great Migration from the southern states to the North after the abolition of slavery, after the American Civil War, those people came to New York, and then suddenly they nurtured, they incubated this incredible explosion of ideas and art and so on and so forth, right? Seemingly came out of nowhere. Seemingly came out of nowhere. Now, 2 generations previous to the Harlem Renaissance, those people were chattel slaves on the southern plantations. They weren't even regarded officially, legally, by society as being human beings. Yet within 2 or 3 generations of them moving from the south to the north to begin to go to places like Harlem and Detroit and other places in the north, in Harlem, suddenly this group of the most neglected, undervalued, displaced, poor, resource poor in one sense, in terms of financial group of people, nurtured an explosion in the arts and in arts which rocked America. I'll give you one example. There's been 2, if you like, innovative musical art forms which America can claim for itself. The first was jazz, and the second, if you like, was its modern reiteration, which was hip-hop. Right? Those are unique art forms which came out of the African-American community. They didn't come out of the Opera House in downtown Manhattan. They didn't come out of the conservatoire, the Juilliard's conservatoire, right? It came out of the brothels in the southern states of America and the honky-tonk piano players, and then, if you like, moved to the north with that population into Harlem, and then jazz exploded onto the American scene. Now, clearly, specifically, it arose out of this particular community I'm talking about. But if you talk about jazz, you have to talk about jazz as being the national soundtrack for the American century. If you talk about jazz, what is jazz? It's fast-paced, it's offbeat, it's energetic, it's syncopated, it's inspirational. It moves from one place to another. It doesn't take set rules. It breaks the rules all the time. You know, this is what jazz is. And in one sense, that's what America was at the beginning of the 20th century. In terms of American capitalism, a rapidly growing American capitalism, which was fast-paced, which was new, that occupied new areas of global commerce and so on and so forth. New populations being drawn into the big cities of America, migrant populations bringing their own different cultures, their own sounds, their own smells, their own ways of doing things, their own ways of thinking and so on and so forth. Jazz is a soundtrack to that civilizational movement at the beginning. So in other words, jazz is, although it came out of this particular community, the most undervalued and underrated community, becomes, if you like, the soundtrack to the American century. And then goes on to innovate into all different areas of art form outside of music. And then hip-hop later, you know, maybe a century later comes along and does exactly the same thing. And becomes a global, artistic and creative and cultural movement. So for me, that talked to the standpoint theory for me, but in real terms, in terms of the Harlem Renaissance. And the philosopher and activist W.E.B. Du Bois put it this way. He said, in that time, the black American laid aside the status of a beneficiary and a ward for that of a collaborator and participant in American civilization. In this way, and this is my words, the African Americans in America became a people rather than a possession or a problem. Of course, there was a long way to go. But they moved, but if you like, he says this, the Harlem Renaissance, W.B. Du Bois said this, spoke with two voices, one from the stage of national culture, which is undoubtedly true, and the other from the soul of the ethnic experience. And the notion of a national culture and the soul of an ethnic experience, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, that was the Harlem Renaissance. And that was the soundtrack, if you like, to America in the first half of the 20th century. And when I began to look at the Harlem Renaissance, I was interested in another aspect of it, which has maybe been rather overlooked, and which I just want to go through with you briefly. And I want to be slightly contentious here. I want to, what do we call it? Resurrect the dead white men. Because one of the bête noirs, if you like, of decolonial narratives or diversity, discussions around diversity, is the notion of the dead white men. The dead white men, you know, they're the problem, they're the blockers standing in the way, they're the people we have to tear down. And in one sense, that's true. But actually, if you look at some of those dead white men, there's a much more interesting story. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of it very quickly. Okay. Here we have, on the left, Georges Balanchine. People heard of Georges Balanchine? He's the guy who dragged ballet as an art form into the 20th century. He revolutionized ballet, basically. He breathed life back into what was basically a dead art form, ballet. An extraordinary person. He was an emigre who ended up in New York in the, let me get it right, in the 1930s to run the New York City Ballet. He was in exile in France when he got a letter from the New York City Ballet, the guys who ran it, the board of the New York City Ballet. This is the story. And the board of the New York City Ballet said this. They said, Mr. Balanchine, we'd love for you to come and run the New York City Ballet. Can you tell us whether you'd like to and what it is that you would need, you want from us before you get here, before you travel from Paris to New York? And Balanchine said, yes, I'd love to run the New York City Ballet. I have one request, is that I have a ballet troupe of dancers, half of whom can be white, but the other half have to be African American. And if you read Balanchine, and in official histories won't tell you anything of this, you could go through your whole life not knowing anything about this, about Balanchine, because it's not in his official autobiography, his official biographies at all. When they talk about Balanchine, they don't talk about the person that I kind of know. They talk about something else completely different. He was interested in the notion of the black body in space, because ballet had up to that time been about a very literally narrow conception of what the body in movement should be. It should be thin, it should be petite, it should be of European stock, it should have some kind of conventional, Western beauty to it. You know, if you think of all the prime ballerinas, they kind of fall into this template. But Balanchine, he thought, I'm going to America. He said, I'm interested in jazz. He was interested in jazz. He said, you know what? I want to work with some African-American dancers. I want them in my ballet troupe. I want to build a modern ballet troupe that actually expresses the reality of America. And so he said, I want half of my ballet troupe to be African-American. And the good burghers of the New York City Ballet wrote back and said, Mr. Balanchine, that's a very interesting suggestion. Unfortunately, we can't grant it, because if we did, there'd be a race riot. And our whole edifice would collapse. So Balanchine reluctantly accepted the post of New York City Ballet without having his one demand fully realized. But what he did instead was he worked throughout his time in America, in the New York City Ballet and afterwards, with African-American dancers. And here on the right of my picture, you can see probably the most prominent, well-known of those African-American dancers, a man called Arthur Mitchell. Arthur Mitchell was from New York, an African-American from New York. After he worked with Georges Balanchine, he went on to found the Dance Theatre of Harlem, which is a very well-known contemporary dance troupe in New York. And Arthur Mitchell worked with Georges Balanchine over a number of years. And Balanchine was rather naughty, because one of the things that the New York City Ballet Board didn't want to see was a black dancer and a white dancer on stage, particularly not a black man and a white woman. So there's George Mitchell dancing a pas de deux with one of the white ballerinas in one of Georges Balanchine's ballets. So he kind of managed to try and subvert what he was denied, if you like, through his career. Now, you know, there's lots of problems with Georges Balanchine. I'm not saying he's a revolutionary. I'm not saying he was, you know, progressive even necessarily. But, and he was he is now a dead white man. But I think Georges Balanchine understood something about a relationship between diversity and artistic creation. And in one sense, this exploration fueled his time at the New York City Ballet and changed the nature of ballet, modern ballet forever. Now, very quickly, here's the other example. On the right there is Balanchine, and he's talking to this guy in glasses, and this guy in glasses is Igor Stravinsky. People know Igor Stravinsky? Igor Stravinsky wrote the most revolutionary piece of classical music, The Rite of Spring, which when it was performed in Paris in, I think it's 1920-something or whatever it was, caused a riot inside the auditorium, because it was so revolutionary that people walked out and screamed and shouted, and actually, apparently in the first concert of Rite of Spring, you can actually hear the music. People were just shouting and protesting. But now, the Rite of Spring is certainly seen as the most revolutionary piece of classical music. And in one sense, again, gave rebirth to classical music and dragged it into the 20th century. So Igor Stravinsky was the great hero, if you like, of classical music. But another thing about Igor Stravinsky was, out of all the musical forms, apart from the one that he worked in, that he loved most of all, he loved jazz. He really did love jazz. And if you listen to his classical compositions, including The Rite of Spring, you can hear the jazz syncopation. It's absolutely amazing. And when Igor Stravinsky traveled from Europe to New York to work, to put on his classical, his operas and so on and so forth, his music, the first thing he did to New York was he didn't go downtown to the great conservatoire or the opera houses or the concert halls. He went straight to Harlem. So Stravinsky went straight to Harlem, and he spent a lot of time in those kind of smoky clubs in Harlem, listening and enjoying jazz and talking to the jazz musicians and the band leaders and so on and so forth. And one of the compositions of Stravinsky, which you probably won't know about, is the Ebony Concerto. The Ebony Concerto was written for a jazz orchestra and is an extraordinary composition. And apparently, he wrote it for this jazz orchestra. He gave the score to them, and they all freaked out, because I thought, how are we going to play Stravinsky? But they managed to do it. And I just want to give you a taste of the Ebony Concerto, so you can hear, if you like, the element of jazz, the melding of jazz and Western classical music. Just have a listen. Can you hear the classical and the jazz? When we launched Creative Case of Diversity, I got a young African-American jazz orchestra to restage the Ebony Concerto. And I think it's the first time it had been played in full in the UK for decades and decades and decades and decades. But again, I thought that although we might call Stravinsky and Balanchine, you know, these dead white men who kind of get in the way of progress, to be honest, my challenge to the arts orthodoxy, the arts hierarchy, is you don't even value your own people properly. Because what you do is you whitewash these guys. Actually, these guys understood more about the relationship between diversity and the creative act than you guys do. So, you know, in one sense, I want to claim Balanchine for the creative case of diversity. I want to claim Stravinsky for the creative case for diversity. I want to value Stravinsky as being a great jazz composer. I want to, you know, in one sense, recognize Balanchine for understanding that actually the whole history of dance isn't just the thin white body moving through space. You know, so in one sense, you know, this notion of recognition, I think, is very important. I just want to end up on this last example. This notion of the outsider. There's a friend of mine called Mehrdad Saif. He's a UK Iranian theatre director who runs a company called 30 Bird Productions in the south of England, making very sort of experimental theatre and performance work. And he talks about this role of being the outsider. And he says this: you are outside of it all. This outsideness is important. Even mentally, I think about standing outside looking in. That is the nature of the engagement. Those of us, who don't really have a country and are never quite 100%, a group of people who you cannot categorize, who have access to so many references, these in-betweeners are increasing. It's the way of the future. And actually, if you look at the development of artistic practice throughout the world, you can see the kind of role played by these in-betweeners, the people on the outside who, in one sense, make a virtue of being on the outside, but who have, obviously, because in one sense, going back to standpoint theory, because they're perched on the ledge, have this extraordinary kind of multifaceted vision, and are trying to express their place in the world. And because their place in the world isn't quite secure, as the people who occupy the great opera houses or the great theatres, because they're kind of in free flow, the work they tend to make tends to be extraordinarily interesting and innovative. And I'll leave you with this example, modern example from the UK. Oh, not that one. Here we go. Modern example from the UK, which is development of a musical form called grime. Has anyone heard of grime? Yeah. Okay. So, what is grime? Okay. Grime, for those people who don't know, you can look up afterwards. Look at people like Dizzy Rascal or Stormzy or people like that, and you'll find out. Grime is like a big thing in the UK. Okay, it hasn't hit South Africa yet. It will do, I'm sure, at some point. But grime came out of, a bit like the Harlem Renaissance, the most neglected kind of put-upon population in London, which is young black kids from African or of Caribbean descent, or mixed race descent as well. And those kids loved hip-hop, but they lived in London. They lived in the tower block London. They lived in the kind of concrete London. They lived in the kind of London where lots of populations kind of lead a marginal existence. They're the kids who kind of gathered outside school, went and got their chicken and chips because they had £2 in their pocket that their mum would give them for some tea, and would begin to spit lyrics at one another. Then they would go to the youth club later on, somewhere in their tower block called a housing estate, social housing estate, and they would begin to riff off tracks and kind of challenge one another You know, it's quite an aggressive art form in that sense. You know, it's about challenging. You're this, I'm that. I don't know. I'm a bit old to kind of describe it, but you kind of get hopefully you'll get my drift. So, and the thing was, for a whole number of years, grime was literally an outlawed musical form. Because these kids, as well as being incredibly innovative and just doing their thing on the street or in the youth clubs, were also the target of racist policing. So these kids couldn't really gather. They couldn't even gather on the street. They couldn't gather in the youth club without the police coming in and arresting them and frisking them and searching them for drugs and taking them down to the police station or giving them a good kicking, you know, out of sight and so forth. And they couldn't even mount their gigs. The council in London, along with the Metropolitan Police, basically told all the music venues in London not to have grime concerts in their place because it would be a public danger. So these kids were literally outlawed as though they were some kind of bandits, when all they were trying to do was make a musical form that talked to them. The whole of the music establishment would have nothing to do with grime. These guys, they did their own work, they recorded their own work on iPhones, or they laid down some tracks, some backing tracks in their bedrooms, and then they gathered, and they did it. And you can find funny enough, you can find a whole history of grime on YouTube, because they'd post all this stuff up on YouTube. They couldn't post it anywhere else. No one would play their music. Radio 1, Radio 2, whatever it is, the big music stations would not play their music. They couldn't get gigs because the police would make sure that they were banned, and so on and so forth. So these kids created a musical form which is clearly about being young and living in inner city London and being put upon by the police and authorities and living rather desperate lives sometimes. It's clearly about the kind of the groups that they moved in, which could be Nigerian or Jamaican or mixed race or poor white working class and so forth. These were kind of integrated groups that they gathered in because these were their school friends and so on and so forth. Completely marginalised group. No one would have anything to do with them. They were completely banned from official society. They were demonised in the press as being gangsters and thugs and killers and God knows what else. And then, about 2 or 3 years ago, grime, almost as if it's fully formed, kind of arrives on the scene. And then suddenly all the music companies go, oh my God, this is really different. Oh my God, this is very interesting. Oh my God, did you see how many hits that particular DJ got on YouTube? Like this DJ here, her name's AG. She's from the East End of London. The moniker is AG. Oh my God, do you see that one person's got 1 million followers? Oh my God, do you see the monetary potential in this? Oh my God, what do you mean they're banning their concerts? Oh, I didn't realise this, that and the other. And then suddenly, of course, the music scene realises that something new and extraordinary and real and vital and unique has risen out of this group of people who have been completely written off by society. Now, if you're in the centre, you only get the signals right at the last minute. But all of us looking at the development of grime could see that something was unique was developing. A kind of, and now, today, to be honest, the people who were just the kids on the street, on a youth club, have now been taken up by the record companies, are now millionaires, they get gigs everywhere, they're getting music awards, they're fated now as being the voice of young people and so on and so forth. In one sense, I say, thank God the establishment never discovered them early on, because it would kill them dead. The fact that they are marginalised and allowed to grow their own musical form actually meant it reached its full expression. And for me, grime is such a good example of the creative case of diversity. The notion of, actually, that the people who you think have the least value end up having the most value. The people who you think don't really represent anything tend to end up innovating an art form. The people who society says have no worth at all suddenly become internationally prominent. And then out of grime comes a new musical form, and there'll be a new musical form after that. But it would have made its impact. It's made its historical impact, if you like. So what I say is this. In one sense, I'm glad that the establishment doesn't value art forms like that because it allows them to develop. But on the other hand, I'm extremely angry that that talent is so ignored and despised, because actually that talent, in some senses, has seen its way through. It has innovated. No one innovated in the middle of the music industry in the UK. The kids off the street innovated a whole different art form. And that's the story of the creative case for diversity. Thank you.
Just going to get 2 chairs to the stage. I would like to welcome Professor Francis Peterson, who will be in conversation with Hassan. Professor Peterson is the Rector and Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Free State.
Hassan, thank you very much for the presentation. I think we give him another hand of applause. It was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Hassan, I'm going to kick off the conversation because I would like at least some questions from the audience as well. I've got about 1 or 2 questions that I want to ask you. The first one, when we talk about diversity, it make, I would say, probably logical sense that if you have diverse inputs,
Yeah.
That the output, the product, should be much more creative, or could be much more creative, could be much more innovative, and probably also is stronger, because you can take that argument outside the art conversation too. But what you have highlighted is that there are sometimes value judgments that constrain the maximization of the impact of diversity. And I just would like to understand what sort of framework do you think, or the Art Council in the UK has put in place to ensure that those value judgments are actually value judgments that make sense? Because if a value judgment is excellence, then I think that should be in there. But if the value judgment is taste, then it's different. So I just would like to, so there's a nuance in terms of those value judgments. Some are probably real, others not. But the way that you have articulated it as a homogeneous, I think, act that reduces the impact of diversity. So I just wanted to say, what sort of framework would you put in place if there isn't from the Art Council?
Well, I'm not at the Arts Council anymore, so I can't speak for them. But if you look at the funding for the arts in the UK, and I don't know whether this is in the case of South Africa or other places which are represented here today, the majority goes to what I would call art forms which maybe more relate to heritage than they do to contemporary arts. So in the UK, the big national opera houses, the big national theatre, the big national ballet, these organisations swallow up most, actually, of the arts funding in the UK. So the rest of us are kind of scrabbling about, if you like, for for the bits and pieces. But these guys are continually invested in. And in one sense, I think it's because these art forms form part of what is seen as being national culture. So they're kind of seen as being the building blocks of our nation, whether that's the big museums, you know, like the British Museum or the Tate Gallery or the National Theatre. These are seen as being part of our national culture. So in one sense, you can't kind of touch them. But so it leaves the rest of the conversation to be a rather kind of minimal conversation over a minimal amount of funds. But my argument would be, well, what do we really mean by a national culture if it's something where, if you like, the innovation that you're talking about, the diversity you're talking about, is not really let in? You know, so we have we have major art form or major representations of art forms in the UK, which don't really represent what Britain really is. It's a kind of notion of what Britain kind of may have been sometime in the past. This great imperial, colonial power, the centre of the world, and so on and so forth. Anyone who watched football knows we're not that anymore.
Sorry.
You don't have to apologise. It's okay. And it's a kind of post-colonial hangover, which is what one academic has called it. So the trouble is, you have this inbuilt inequality. So even like you and I can agree, and lots of people might agree on the common sense that more diversity means more innovation, and so on and so forth. Although lots of people, you know, we've kind of won the argument there, but what we haven't won is a restructuring of the arts that really reflects the kind of conclusions that argument might lead. Now, taste, you say, is subjective, which I agree with. But to be honest, so are notions of quality and excellence. Yeah? So what you might find to be excellent, I might not agree to be excellent. You might consider La Bohème as created by the National Opera as being excellent. I might think that a small piece of contemporary music in a small art space somewhere in a province or whatever it is might have excellence in and of itself, and that it speaks directly to the audience. As far as I'm concerned, excellence is only really about whether or not it speaks directly to its audience, whatever that audience might be. So one of the arguments we had to have in the Arts Council was to say excellence is not a neutral judgment. It is loaded with all sorts of value judgments, and quality the same way. Now, you might consider, you know, a £4 million set for the National Opera to put on some opera to have notions of excellence because it looks so shiny and bright. But actually, excellence can also be found in unexpected places. And again, it's whether or not the art form articulates itself and has relevance to its audience. So again, excellence is not necessarily a neutral judgment. There's an accepted notion of what excellence and quality is, but you can't pretend that it's neutral.
Hassan, I want to further that point and go to your standpoint theory that you mentioned. And I want to cite an example, because you cite the example of Roads Must Fall. So I unfortunately was at the heart of the valley when Roads Must Fall happened at UCT. And I'm trying to understand, in fact I asked myself the question at that point, why did that happen? Because it wasn't only about the road statue. It was really a lot about other things. And the conclusion that I got to is that it was around the pace of transformation and the sense of belonging. And what has happened is that we have students mainly from poor black, not actually poor, because the students at UCT is not genetically that poor, but students from disadvantaged backgrounds that came into a culture that already existed, and they had to assimilate to the culture, right? And what has happened over the past years, and unfortunately it happened when I was there, The breaking point was that there was enough critical core of those groups that felt they need to be assimilated to the dominant culture. And when that critical core reached the tipping point, and they're not the majority, they just had reached a critical core, the rose must fall happened, and all the other things that went through with that. Now, I'm trying to go back to your standpoint theory, where you're talking about the marginalized sitting on the edges, and the dominant culture, if I can use that terminology, in the middle. One way of trying to articulate bringing the two together is that if the marginalized on the edges get themselves organized in a way, and then try to develop that critical core, that the level of innovation that they bring with them is not reduced when it reaches the dominant culture. That might be one theory to counter the sort of standpoint theory. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts. How would you bring that marginalized into the center? You mentioned tipping the cone, but that might not work. You know, physically, it's a nice thing to do. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts. You didn't unpack it because obviously there was not a lot of time. But just your thoughts. How do we bring the marginalized into the center?
Well, just on your first point, and I recognise your analysis of the Rose Must Fall campaign and what it was about. And if you read Pierre Bourdieu, you know, who writes on this question of taste and power, what he says is, it's not that just that I have my taste and you have your taste. The point is that you accumulate power through your notion of taste. Your taste is an expression of power. And Bourdieu talks about, so it's not just, you know, I like this and you like that. He talks about symbolic taste containing symbolic acts of violence. And I think this notion of assimilating into a dominant culture is in one sense an act of violence, you know, a symbolic act of violence. Because what it says is you have to strip away this, that and the other to fit in. I'm a governor of a small drama college in the UK, and we have this issue of, for example, students from African and Caribbean backgrounds and what was this, who are minority, coming into a particular culture which has grown up. And the people who operate within the culture don't see that actually there are symbolic acts of violence which take place when you ask someone to basically to peel away a bit of their identity to be able to assimilate into majority. Now sometimes, you know, that can be a plastic negotiation, you know, and that's a different matter. But assimilation, I think, the prerequisite is kind of one way. But in terms of your standpoint theory, I've come to the conclusion that the gravitational pull of the centre is very, very big, and that it's almost always contains these acts of assimilation or symbolic acts of violence as you move into the centre. And what tends to happen, as I said, is that certain aspects of what actually is unique tend to get stripped away, kind of jettisoned as you make that journey. So what's the option? I think the option is what I talked about. People like Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict, these are anthropologists, and Bourdieu. They talk about decentering. So they talk about not the notion of trying to reform the centre, but to try and grow, if you like, centres of authority and power in different places, which can provide a challenge to the centre. So the centre isn't always the middle of the conversation. It's a bit like insurgent guerrilla warfare, I guess. Maybe I'm being a bit Che Guevara about it, I don't know. But this notion of actually we need to accumulate to ourselves ways and means by which we can express our artistic visions, which are not filtered through the centre. And to do that, I think I've come to the conclusion we have to build our own infrastructures. You know, we have to build our own theatre companies. We have to build our own ways of showing our visual arts. We have to be much more rooted in communities, maybe. Maybe that's one thing, not necessarily the only thing. So my answer would be is we have to not try and change the centre, although we do want some of those resources, but we need to de-centre.
Okay, that's a good response. Let me hear whether there's any questions. You just have to lift your hands because I'm competing with the light there. There's one over there.
Good morning. My name is Ukona. I'm part of the Open Lab residency, and your entire talk was very affirming to my line of thinking. So first, thank you. And I really like what you had to say about the fact that this idea of incremental kind of change is a hoax because, because also we can't deny the fact that parallel to all these talks where we all agree about what is possible and what needs to happen with regards to diversity, there's also a real concept of self-preservation by those who benefit from having the status quo as it is. So it's one thing to sit and talk about it, but when it comes to, for example, and I mean, I like that you made that example, the fact that one never questions the price of opera tickets, but I have to kind of justify why calling people into some village in the Eastern Cape has any kind of money that needs to be exchanged. So politics around value creation and who decides what is valuable come to mind. So so maybe it's not a question, just to say I kind of agree with the idea of making the periphery, not making the periphery the center, but decentralization, but also, disruption. And okay, I'll stop there for now, but thank you.
Thank you.
So that was a comment? Do you just the comment, okay. There's one at the back there. Thank you for the comment.
Hello, I'm Ella Ziegler, one of the artists and facilitators of the Open Lab. I just want to say thank you for the talk, and but I just want to I have three comments. One is, I think there were always female artists with children who were successful. Second, I think also men decide to have children, not only women. And the third is, I think the standpoint theory very much comes from a time before internet. I think one cannot apply that model anymore exactly today. I think one can quote it because there's not one center anymore. Right. There's not one circle around the center, which is the periphery. There are many peripheries and many centers, I think. That's why that model before internet, because the self-publishing abilities of people who use YouTube is creating many centers, and I think the interest also, that was the time when capitalism was not on the place where we are now, because now the exploitation of the periphery by interests of like making money is very different from, when was that theory created? In the 70s, yeah. I think we are 40, 50, nearly 50 years later. It's a very different situation now concerning cultural production and art production. And what was my question? How do you think does education influence creativity, or how does, education, like school education, university education?
Well, on the last question, if we accept that, there's a critical thinker in the UK called Raymond Williams, and he talked about culture being ordinary. And what he was trying to say, I guess, it was a kind of democratic notion that we all have an imagination, we all have creativity, we express creativity in different ways in our lives, which is not necessarily, might not be recognised as art, but certainly has some kind of creative element to it. And therefore the notion of children who are most open, I think, having worked with young people for a long time in theatre, who are most open to notions of the imagination, of possibilities, and so on and so forth, I think it's very important. I mean, we all need to generate some more possibilities about our futures. I think we can probably all agree on that. The problem is, particularly I can talk about the UK experience, is that creativity has been written out of our school curriculum. When I first started theatre, I worked for a theatre and education company, and we serviced maybe 50 schools in our catchment area, and we took in high quality, I consider it to be high quality theatre into those schools, from primary schools up to upper secondary schools, so from 6 to 18, 20, I don't know. And but all of those theatre companies that I was part of were all cut by the government in the 1990s, I think it was, in the 1990s and so on and so forth, and not replaced. I mean, I would argue that we should have arts-based curriculums. I believe that we should be able to teach all of the disciplines through an artistic lens. And I think, to be honest, that would probably be more suited to, if you like, the developing brain of young people in terms of, like I say, their particular qualities that they have, which we as adults don't. I agree with you about the question of female art. I wasn't making the point that as soon as you have a baby, you necessarily have to drop out. But that is the general. All I'm talking about is the structures that we've grown inside art forms, which, in different ways, clearly discriminate against different groups of people. That's what I was trying to say. Well, I do believe it.
Where's the mic? Is the mic somewhere? Because, yeah, can you just repeat what you said? I think there might be other people that haven't heard what you said. No, I'm just talking to you over there because you.
I know it's true. I'm an artist and I have children, and my career really dropped because I have children. But if we repeat that again and again, I just don't want to repeat it again and again, because I know it's like that. I think we all know it's like that, but I just feel like there are so many more it's just carving in the same. You know, we are trying. It's like I believe in it that it's like that, but I don't believe in it. But by repeating it again and again, it makes it stronger, I think.
Okay, I think there might be people that differ from you, but nevertheless, I think you made your statement. I'm going to come back to you now. I just think they're just going to take the hand behind you. Yeah.
Yes. Hey, Hassan, thank you for another great talk. I just had a quick question with regards to, because I feel like England or the UK is quite far advanced when it comes to this diversity question. I'm from the Netherlands myself, but live in New York, and I think there's a lot of catching up to do. Are there maybe some practical things that you can talk about with regards to the creative case of diversity, of how that can actually inform change into the art sector? Because I know there are some, but it might be very nice to hear a bit about that.
Yes. Erwin, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in one sense, I think we've won the argument, but we haven't seen, by and large, a shift in the resources that kind of aligns with that argument. Nonetheless, since we've had this dialogue within the Arts Council and within the arts sector, subsidised arts sector in the UK, there have been certain measures put in place to try and, if you like, equalise the playing field. So, for example, and some of them I think probably work better than others, but the ones that are working well. I think one of the things that the Arts Council in England has invested in is leadership. So that therefore, I guess, which is not necessarily, well, it can be about changing the nature of the arts environment, but really it's about trying to develop different voices, whether they be people of minority groups, women, disabled people, and so on and so forth, trying to develop them as artistic leaders to allow them to show their worth. Now, in the past, we had lots and lots of training stuff for artistic leaders, but they were never given the opportunity to, they were told that you could make a whole career out of just being in training, right? But what you never got was a chance to direct on the main stage, or you never got to be commissioned to compose a piece of music and then see an orchestra play it, or whatever it is. So there has been establishment of certain leadership development places in the arts in the UK, which have insisted that there's a practical aspect by which, at the end of it, you will be in charge of an artistic project. You will have a chance to direct on the main stage. In fact, I've just seen one of the change makers, as they're called, that I've been working with, a guy called Javad Adipur, who directed the main stage in a regional theatre. And it was unprecedented for that to happen at his stage in his career. And he actually rose to the challenge and he did incredibly well. So there's this notion of development of leadership. There's also the development of funds specifically for certain groups of people, which again are people who historically have been shut out of the system. That's working well. There's the development of one thing which I think is very important. There's development of a whole new layer, hopefully, of new producers, particularly in the performing arts, because one thing we've really lacked in the UK is a diverse layer of producers. So it's beginning to grow up encourage a new layer of producers who can put on work, who can talk about work, who can talk authoritatively about the work, who can represent artists, and so on and so forth. But also, I have to say, so there's those kind of things, which, to be honest, everyone could invent if they want to. It's really not rocket science when you see what the problem is to find a solution that fits it in that short and medium term. But also, there's been grown up kind of grassroots movements, which I think have been putting pressure on the sort of the arts establishment to change. So there's an organisation called Act for Change, which is trying to get more black actors into roles and get more roles written for black actors that they can perform, for example. There's similar organisations around disability in the arts to make sure that disabled people are working in art spaces which take account of them and what they have to offer, both artistically and in other ways. And there's also, actually, in some of our media houses, there's beginnings of quotas, which I think is a bit at the end of the line issue. You know, I'm not against quotas, but what it tells you is that you failed if you have to impose quotas. But a lot of our TV outputs are imposing quotas on production teams and things like that. So there's much more diverse production teams, making a much more diverse product for the media. So there's a whole number of things going on. But most of all, I think people are beginning to get together and articulate a need and put a pressure on. And I think that's what's beginning to make these kind of things. The one thing that is coming up quite fast, on the left as it were, is this notion of cultural democracy. And I think that could have quite far-reaching effect, the notion of actually, which is much more fundamental, I think, in terms of arguing for change, this notion of some kind of cultural democracy.
Okay. Do you still want to ask your question at the back?
No, it was a comment.
What's the comment? All right, you still want to make it? Yeah. Yeah, all right, have you got the mic there? Yeah, okay.
The comment I want to make about, I do agree that there are women who have children who have had excellent careers in the arts and other places. But I think what Hassan is talking about are frameworks, institutional ways that we work that can exclude women. And I would say, I think in the last 2 years in Britain, there was a whole movement about female choreographers. And this was not women of colour. This was also white women saying that because they have children, they find they they have to drop out of dance, and dance is male-dominated in terms of leadership, not in terms of who's dancing on the stages. So I think the argument here is true that if you believe it, I think we're not believing that, okay, because I have children, that's the end of my career. But are the structures changing to enable more women to stay on? I think that's it. And in the terms of the standpoint theory, yes, it was made in the 70s, but there are certain theories that still speak to the structures. There are individual artists that can get on YouTube and you can say that the margins and the periphery has moved. But in terms of how institutions organize, how people get to the main stages, and how they get recognition in society, how they get into the curriculum, that is not moving fast enough. And that's why standpoint theory is still relevant. I'll give you an example. Right now in Britain, 3 artists who will be called culturally diverse are going to be programmed on the main stage of one of the theatres. That's great. In 2018, Arts Council started funding what they called ethnic minorities at the time in 1976. So it's taken since 1976 for Black British to get to the main stage. African American, yes. Dance Theatre of Harlem, yes. But why not Black British? Many questions asked. What is the publicity going out about these artists? They're calling one of them an emerging artist. We are introducing to you this emerging artist who's coming onto the main stage. I attended a workshop by this emerging artist in Senegal this year. She had delegates from 17 countries around the world. America, Brazil, both black and white, all sorts of countries in the world who attended her workshop. Does an emerging artist pull that amount of people? She's performed in Japan, she's performed in Australia, she's performed all over the world. She has toured. She's still called emerging. Why? What does that do? That erases her whole history. That erases the dance technique she has created. So if I now say I want to raise funds to do a project on her choreography, oh, she's emerging. She's not yet there. That is what people from the establishment will say, because the venues in which she teaches are not one of the major venues. She's out of the center. She's in the periphery, according to the people that have the resources. And that is the map that needs to change. That's where the centers need to move from. So they recognize that when something's happening in Deptford, it is of importance. And if an artist comes out of there, what she's doing is important. So they should say, yes, we're introducing you, the audience of this building, to this artist. She's new to you. She has actually been working for about upwards of 15 years. She has dancers she has produced who are international in their own right. So the things that need to shift, not our personal narratives in here. I don't think I'm marginal. But if we're going to make an impact on the nation and to the context we're addressing here, that has to shift. And therefore, things like standpoint theory are still relevant in the context we're addressing.
Thank you. Any more questions, the audience? There's one over there, yeah.
I feel a bit bad now that I'm coming after your point, which I thought was so interesting, and I'm looping back into education. But firstly, I'd like to just thank you for an incredibly interesting and really inspiring talk. I think a lot of the things you are talking about are still so relevant in our context, even though I think a lot of them sounds like common sense to me. So I think I'm sort of looping back to this notion of common sense, and diversity is quite a loaded topic anywhere, but particularly in South Africa. So I wanted to know whether you changed your presentation slightly because you were presenting in South Africa, or how do you feel that our context fits into a more global center? Are we on your radar? What we're doing with, I think Roads Must Form was quite a seminal moment, and I think creatively it speaks to a change in mindset. I just want to know whether you agree or whether this makes ripples in Britain.
Oh, well, the Roads Must Fall campaign definitely made ripples in Britain. it encouraged like a decolonial movement amongst the students in the UK, because there's a fair few statues to Rhodes in the UK, as you can imagine. I haven't really changed the talk in terms of South African context, because I didn't want to second guess or generalise about your particular situation, although I was hoping that some of the stuff had a kind of universal impact, I guess. But I'm intensely interested in what's happening in South Africa. Funnily enough, one of my observations is it may not seem it to you, but I think the progress made since the fall of apartheid, I know all the problems and the issues around economics and whatever it might be, but in the arts, I think the progress that you've made in the arts is being quicker than the progress that we've made in the UK in the same period, funnily enough. I don't know, that's a feeling I get, which gives me hope, because it shows me that there are counterexamples to the notion that you can just have gradual change. But you have to wait 20 or 30 years for it to kind of filter through, kind of thing. That actually you can have more fundamental change over a shorter period of time. It shows it's possible, and I like things that show that more radical change at a fast-moving pace is possible. I don't know if that's answered your question at all. What have I missed out? Yeah. But I'm glad it has some resonance anyway.
So we're going to have one more question, then we have to wrap up because we're running late. And there's...
I've got a microphone.
You've got a microphone, but somebody else also could. Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much, Hassan. I totally appreciate the talk. My name's Paul Gazola. I work artistic director of a company in South Australia, and I kind of find this notion of the peripheral very interesting. I don't operate this organisation in a major capital. I work very much in urban and regional contexts. But my question is more practical, actually. There's a real strong problematic for me with the words that I'm kind of having to use writing grant applications. Things like excellence, you kind of said we do high quality productions. What other words do you kind of pull out of your vocabulary to kind of go around those things, given the problematics that they kind of bring forth?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think you have to take on. Well, it's two things. I think you have to take on. Don't think you can ignore those questions because those concepts are so loaded, and that somehow you have to critique them. This notion that excellence can only be one thing, that quality is defined by this, that, and the other. And rigidly in the Arts Council, in terms of how they assess applications, it's quite clear that they use singular notions of quality and excellence, mostly, in terms of assessing whether or not people should get money from funds, for example. So I think you do have to take on, you have to go onto that ground, if you like. But the thing about creative cases of diversity is what I wanted it to be about was a conversation about art and creativity, first and foremost, because I think we were getting tired in the UK of having these kind of side arguments about diversity and equality, where, we kind of have this boring conversation over here about why we weren't getting enough money. And then the big guys, as it were having this wonderful conversation about art and innovation and progress and quality and excellence and all these kind of concepts over there. So we thought, actually, what we'd do is let's plant diversity and equality argument in an artistic context rather than a context necessarily even about rights or about economics or about morality. Shouldn't we do this or shouldn't it be more equal? Let's have a conversation that everyone can have about art. But to come back to your point, I think we have to attack those notions, but at the same time, I think we have to grow a new generation of artistic thinkers and critics who can come up with different ways to express what we know as quality and excellence, but in their own terms. And in one sense, I can't really second guess what those terms or concepts, alternative terms and concepts must be. All I know is we have to find the younger generation of artists And we have to encourage them to, and we have to validate the language in which they assess those old-fashioned terms like quality and excellence. So for me, it's more about let's encourage some the one thing we don't have is avenues for young people entering the arts in the UK to have forums for critical debate where they can work out some of these things. What diversity might mean to them, what equality might mean to men, what does decolonisation mean, really, in the early 21st century, not harking back necessarily to Frantz Fanon and whatever it might be. You know, but we have to find some way of encouraging those people to grow and hone a new language of art criticism and theory, which can finally do away with those singular terms and express something more rich about maybe that reflects more about how art is produced these days, as opposed to notions of how it's produced 100 years ago.
Fantastic conversation. I hope that we could have continued with this, but unfortunately, there's a timeline, and I'm pretty sure that those questions that we didn't answer during tea time, they can ask those to Hassan. So, ladies and gentlemen, Hassan Mahamdallie, thank you very much for an excellent presentation and for the conversation afterwards.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for that. Sorry, it's my fault. I cut it short, so blame me, not Prof. But the reason why I cut it short is that we are running a little bit behind, but we will have the opportunity to open up the long table conversation as well. So please hang on to those questions and join the long table conversation and air those thoughts. It is now 20 to 12. So if you can go have your tea, and if you can please be seated by 12 o'clock, then we can start. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'd just like to ask if any of the other guests who need to be seated at the table, you can already come to the table, seeing that we have very little time for this conversation. So, good, you can sit anywhere, and I'll sit anywhere after that. I'm just quickly going to explain. My name is De Beer Klutter. I'm the host of the long table today, and I'm just going to explain how the format of the long table works, and then I'll give each one of our guests at the table an opportunity just to introduce themselves. So the long table is similar to a dinner conversation. Everyone is seated at the table and can participate in the conversation. I, as the host, will assist you with that. This is a complete democracy, so whoever wants to talk is more than welcome. If you, as a member of the audience, would like to participate, you're more than welcome to join us here at the table. You can take a seat, and then when it's your opportunity to speak, I will indicate it as such. There may be silence, there may be awkwardness, there's possibly going to be laughter, and there is going to be an end, but not necessarily a conclusion. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce the guests around the table, and we're going to do that alphabetically. So we're going to start with David.
Hey, I'm David Doyle. I'm the Executive Director of Data, Disability in the Arts, Disadvantage in the Arts Australia. And I've been working in the Free State for 4 years, nearly setting up Free State Arts and Health.
Thank you very much. Julia is up next.
Hi, I'm Julia Drouin. I'm a French artist based in Tasmania, and I work with sound and airwaves and group of people to make research about the embodiment of invisible sound streams to reveal social frictions.
Up next is Tariq.
Well, my microphone. Does that work? Oh, great. Hello, I'm Tariq. I am an artist and producer and programmer and curator, I think is the last thing on my list. I'm based in Brighton, UK, at a little venue, small venue called the Marlborough Pub and Theatre. It's small but also packs a mighty punch, and we are committed to diversity in everything that we do.
Thank you. Zipmeza, you're up next.
Hello, my name is Zipmeza Kundai, and I am an art maker, I am a performer, I am a photographer. I run a Pan-Africanist, womanist organization focusing on queer narratives.
Thank you. And then Marcus.
Hi, my name is Marcus Neustetter. I'm an artist. You're actually sitting in my studio that I've had for the last 5 days. We've been working on a show in the space, which is tonight at 6 and then Saturday at 6. I work as an artist at the intersection of art, science, technology, specifically focusing on engagement and participation. And I run a company called the Trinity Session that focuses on looking at diverse methodologies for getting art activations in different disciplines, kind of cross-disciplinary practice and public art.
Thank you. And then we have some more guests here at the table. I'm just going to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves as well.
Thank you. My name is Fumi Adewale. I'm a lecturer in dance at De Montfort University in Leicester, England. I also work as a dramaturg, and I perform as a storyteller.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Kenneth Uhoho. I'm from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm a theatre maker and the co-founder of the Lagos Fringe. I ran the Lagos Theatre Festival for 5 years, and I'm here with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you're familiar with everyone at the table now. And I'm just going to start off the conversation, and after that you won't hear from me much more. I'd like to know from each person, whether as a policymaker or as a practicing artist, how do you create in your practice platforms to facilitate diversity? Okay. Whoever wants to start?
So I can talk about the Fringe program that I put together in Brighton for our venue. This year I did my 10th Fringe program, and it's developed over the years how we choose which shows come in. Like with a lot of Fringes, we don't get to see the work before it arrives, which can sometimes make you susceptible to putting on work that maybe doesn't really uphold the creative case for diversity. And this is something that has happened a couple of times in previous years, where we've had some shows that on the outside looked like they were really doing something powerful, and actually when it came to being on stage, they were maybe upholding one community whilst stepping on another. So that developed, that led to us developing a policy that we share with the artists when they come and apply to be part of the Fringe, where we explain to them that as part of the creative case for diversity, not only are we trying to make sure that we are expressing a diverse range of narratives on the stage, but also we want a diverse audience, and we have a very diverse audience for such a small venue. We work a lot with the trans community in Brighton, for example, but there's a considerably large POC community, that's people of colour, which is a British term. I'm not sure of how that translates in South Africa. But so yeah, we've made a policy that says to people that we want to keep our audiences safe as well. And so it's important to us that we don't have any work that contains any stereotypes or negative depictions of marginalized people. And I think particularly, one other thing that I really keep an eye out for is, because there is a trend now for diverse stories, there's a bit of a fashion for it, which on the one hand is exciting, but also can lead to some problems. And so for me, when we have work from someone, for example, if someone wants to put on a show about trans people or a trans person, I will check, I will specifically ask, was there any trans people in the making of this work? Who wrote it, or is this just from your imagination of what you think a trans person is? And if there isn't someone involved, or more than one person really ideally, in the making of this work, then I won't have it in my venue. So yeah, that's a couple of examples. One is working with the artists to let them know about that we need to keep our audiences safe, and also to make sure that artists are bringing narratives that are of their own, rather than an appropriated one.
Anywhere else at the table you'd like to share?
I'm going to specifically speak briefly about the Trinity session and the projects in public space. We run a major public art program in the city of Johannesburg and have been doing in Port Elizabeth, etc. And one of the biggest concerns is that advertising public art programs to artists to come forward, whether it's in the performance or in the visual arts, etc., is that only those that are educated to read the call or that are connected to the network of the calls get access to that, and which means that your notion of diversity is really defined by who gets access to that information. And so one of the key components has been to not necessarily look at what kind of background people have, but rather what energy and enthusiasm they have. So our strategy has been to go directly to the source of where the work is going to be presented and collate a kind of a guerrilla action, if you want to call it that, an intervention in those spaces that draws out the creatives that want to be part of a program. And the most beautiful part of that is that we find people that have got no affiliation to the arts whatsoever, that actually are doing this because they're passionate about it, not because they studied it or because someone told them they can be artists, but actually because they have picked up a piece of paper and a pen and quickly drawn something and shown us and said, look, I can be an artist if you want me to. And I think that kind of personality that is focused on survival and opportunistic maybe even, is able to adapt quite quickly to produce something quite amazing. And so we've changed unofficially, I mean, obviously the city's got a certain policy that you have to follow and their structures, etc., but we've changed our process of commissioning and working in public space quite specifically to be as inclusive as possible in the approach on how to extract the content. And I think the notion of diversity is very site-specific, because one neighborhood might be a neighborhood of mainly, let's say, young coloured communities within a certain area in Soweto. And that's just that little Noordgesig, this little neighborhood that's covered and filled with that group of people. They see hearing each other's stories. Now suddenly the notion of diversity is when a Mlungu, a white man, comes and enters that neighborhood. And so what we've tried to also do is kind of question the borders that lie around. So the notion of diversity and inclusivity in that process has been to say, how do you bridge the borders that lie between places rather than just investigating the community that's within one space? Because it's only through that exposure of exchange that we can break that down and actually create more opportunity. And it's worked so far. We've had really good success stories of complexities and fights and all the rest of it. I think that's part of it. But also this ability to get to know each other. And it's only through this process that I was just explained that it's worked. And we're still testing. So, yeah.
Thank you. I guess one of the privileges of being an Australian and working in Australia is the incredible policy-rich environment that we have, but also the fact that most Australian policy is co-created with the population groups that policy is for. And I just wanted to, I guess, talk a little bit about Julia Gillard, who was our Prime Minister 3 Prime Ministers ago and Australia's only female Prime Minister, who came up with an incredible policy called Closing the Gap, which was really about giving all Australians a fair go and equalising access to the wealth of the nation, particularly for Aboriginal Australians and people with a disability. And because I've worked in the disability space and the mental health space for 30 years, it's been amazing to sit with people with a disability and people with mental illness and government at the same table and to come up with things like the National Disability Arts Strategy, which really looked at the fact that the 20% of Australians who have a disability weren't getting access to arts funding directly. And see, I guess, structures both at federal government and with our arts funding bodies that have opened up resources for Australians with a disability. And what that has really done is it means that it's now people with a lived experience of disability or mental illness who are leading practice, who are leading the companies, and who are also leading policy. And, you know, I don't really see that happening in a lot of other countries except perhaps New Zealand.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Thank you. In terms of my work, I'll talk about what the interface between the academic and the professional practitioner. We've talked about standards of evaluation and the standard of evaluation being singular. And a lot of these standards of evaluation come out of the art history. So if the work of black practitioners, and usually my work is around mostly choreographers who use African or African American or Caribbean dance forms, if they don't appear in any kind of curriculum, then the idea of where's the standard of innovation coming from? And it usually comes from the art history. So if they're not in the art history, then the standard of evaluation that they are subjective to comes from other art forms, because there's not a discourse around their work. Now, this affects the funding practice as well, because what happens is that the arts officers come from a certain kind of education which excludes people of color or non-Western artistic practice, and it sets a spatial arrangement within institutions where you succeed when you manage to get into certain venues. So the artist is supposed to move along as maybe an individual and get into certain venues. If you don't get into those venues, you haven't really arrived. So there's a sort of trajectory of where you're supposed to go and what excellence is. So the work I've been doing is to develop other narratives and to show the intersections between what we sometimes call the mainstream. So in dance we call the margins and the mainstream before you get into the mainstream. So to show the intersections and to make the dance world more complex. So that's what my thesis was on. But before I did my PhD, I did a project in 2007 called the Heritage Project, where we did a year project, which was an arts exhibition on the the dance companies from the 1930s to the 1990s in Britain, black-led dance companies. We also were able to publish a book which recorded their narratives, their interviews with those artists. So people, and then, even though it was a small project, I would consider it a small project, and then some workshops. What we found then is that students had information to start writing their thesis. And even though it was just a single book and an arts exhibition showing these companies existed, we had a lot of people doing BAs in dance saying, or theatre saying, I didn't know these companies existed. I wanted to write on a black choreographer. I had to write on an African-American choreographer because we didn't have anything on Britain. And it started shifting the dynamics. So now I'm part of Hot Foot. I'm one of the board, one of the advisory committee, and Hot Foot is an online magazine about choreography in Britain and choreographers who use African-based or African-related forms, and there can be white choreographers who are working in that space as well that are also featured. And what we do there is also raise the narrative. And we decided, actually, in the last meeting, which was a week ago, to stop calling ourselves marginalized and say we're moving from the margins. So, and to just talk about the work. So it has begun to sort of shift the narrative, and people now say, they can't just say, black work is colourful and bouncy and bubbly and nothing else is happening in the work. We're learning that we have to theorise the work along with the practitioner, and that is the shift. Go and interview the practitioner. Go and watch the practitioner. When you're theorising their work, make sure that the practitioner's voice is appearing in that theory, and it's not just a theory you've taken off the shelf there and imposing upon them.
Yes, thank you very much.
I started to create platforms for diversity when I was a student because I had some airtime on Radio Campus Paris, where I could actually say anything and invite anyone, which was amazing at that time. And the response to it was really positive. So I created a radiophonic creation day 7 years ago, which was a call out to do any kind of sound art pieces, no restrictions. For 24 hours, so it was a bit of a radiothon, so no publicity or fake publicity if you wanted, on 56 radio and art center in 30 countries, and we had 100 artists responded. And that experience really showed me what I really like to do, which was working with very different people and set up some kind of intense durational artwork. We had also walks in the streets and listening session. And really the challenge was to connect all those people at the same time, even if they were all in different places. And after this experience, I think it really set up my love for airtime platforms, because it's a communication tool that can invade and occupy private and public space at not such a big cost if you can convince the right people, which sometimes is hard. And that led me to do a collaborative project that I'm doing in Tasmania with Philippa Stafford, which is called Sisters Acousmatica, which provides a platform to promote and support women and non-binary artists in public space through expanded radio projects, usually in public space and on airwaves. And it includes artworks, curated artworks for festivals, but also workshops or residencies, or like we did recently a sound camp when we asked 7 women and non-binary artists to join us in a specific place with no pressure, no outcome. If they wanted to just sleep for 5 days, they could. And in that kind of context, we actually couldn't help ourselves, I guess, and we did a lot of creative work together. But it's important as well to really secure some kind of safe space for artists to be able to unpack what they really want to do, because sometimes you just push to get an outcome project and it has to fit certain criteria. But I think it's when you have this kind of time and space, I mean, you have time to explore a certain space, then you can actually, you are maybe more able to create something that will talk to others. And I just want to say that this time of residency and research is one of the platforms I encourage, and this kind of economy I encourage, because that's when, as an outsider, for example, me coming here in South Africa for AIR, Altitude Immersive Radio, supported by PIAD and Public Art Project, it gave me time to actually explore the city and meet people. And the project is made by local authors who made poetry in collaboration with Tasmanian poets. But the idea was for me to provide another radiophonic platform for local voices to be heard on radio waves and also in public space, because we did a walk in the streets yesterday. And that was really challenging experience, because we had to convince a relay of radio stations to work together, one after the other, to broadcast a soundtrack that we made together. But I think they all had fun yesterday. Yeah.
Hello. I'm very cold, yeah. So forgive me. I guess one of the downsides of being Nigerian is that you live in you grow up in a place where culture and education has been relegated to the back burner, and this thing has been so institutionalized that even though there's a vibrant theater culture now, the level of acceptance is still not high, as we would love it. Lagos has over close to 20 million people, and when you do a festival, you still can get 5,000 people to come through a festival ground, One of the things that we did to encourage diversity and inclusiveness was in 2015, as the artistic director for the Lagos Theatre Festival, we curated some rather, so just so you know, in Nigeria, it's 14 years in jail if you are accused for homosexuality and all that. So it's very frowned upon in Nigeria. So what we did was to curate about 4 shows that were very diverse and had messaging in that regard. Create shows that were for LGBTQ communities and all that, but there were 4 of them. But we sort of managed the process. First thing we did was to incorporate the outdoor theater policy. So it's not, because there's a lack of infrastructure in a city of 20 million people, maybe just 2 theaters exist, 2 functional or non-functional theaters. And then we have over 100 multi-purpose buildings who, all they do is weddings and all that. So what we did was and these plays cannot be curated at those theaters, because when people come, there's going to be a fiasco of some sort. Yeah, so we curated them for the festival. We got them during the call-outs. We invited them to come in so that we can discuss the scripts as well as the work, and then sort of manage the synopsis so that in the messaging to the public, it will still sound very acceptable, and as well as the digital marketing part of it. So when people, but it was well received in the end, and we had another project called the Inclusiveness for People Living with Disabilities. It was the first time at the time when people living with disabilities did a play for the public at a festival. It was the first time it ever happened in 2016 at the Lagos Theatre Festival. So it's growing, and right now we're working on the play for people living with disabilities, by people living with disabilities, and it might present itself at the Lagos Fringe in November. So, yeah.
Thank you. We are running out of time, which is very strange to say because it feels like we've just started. But I was wondering if anyone in the audience would like to ask any questions to anyone at the table at the moment. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to make it available. Can we talk to 1:45? Fantastic. Then we have 15 minutes. You're more than welcome to still ask as many questions as you would like. Anyone at the table want to respond to anyone right now and talk about how there might be a possibility of working together and exploiting? I don't like the word exploiting that much, but exploiting the idea of diversity and using diversity to educate audience members. Anyone?
I wouldn't mind prompting. One of the key challenges we always have, we come together in these festivals or in these programs, but we share these common visions, and I kind of see like-minded people in this room. But it's the ability to actually learn from each other's programs and processes more efficiently. And one of the key problems that we've had nationally and kind of on the continent is that we haven't had much time in each other's festivals, that we haven't had much time for that kind of exchange. And so it's almost more of a prompt and a kind of a question around how more efficient can we be instead of fielding and hosting festivals in pitching this notion of diversity, to actually just catch the public by total surprise, catch each other by total surprise, and actually prompt a much more of a dialogue-based exchange where, and this is no disrespect to where we're sitting right now, where we don't have 15 minutes to talk, but rather the whole time of the festival to talk, which is what this festival is all about. I'm just putting it out there because I think there are probably models that we can grow here that come out of a need for survival for our disciplines to actually make it into the future, because we're competing with science, we're competing with economics, etc., and politics, that it almost needs a kind of bit more of an kind of action to make it work. Yes. So I'm just putting it out there.
I've got a question. I'm just going to yell it, don't worry about the mic. There is a beer tent and there is a wine tent, but there's no excuse for you not to go chat to each other.
I don't drink. Yeah, I don't drink either. That's diversity. Not everyone drinks. Also,
some people are also deaf. I have hearing loss, so for me, being in a very noisy space where everyone's drunk, it's not my idea of networking. So actually, I would encourage, hopefully, maybe for future things here or any other festivals that people put on, to create other multiple spaces. I know definitely for some people, alcohol helps with networking, so that's fine. But different kinds of spaces for networking. So, the speed dating things work for some people, again, not for others. Because I think I would definitely have done a little bit more networking had there been other opportunities, and I have been doing them bit by bit. I just want to say, while I have the mic, that actually a lot of the time that we can make changes a lot just by speaking our truths, by speaking the voice that often doesn't get heard. I was fortunate enough to meet Kenneth a few years ago. Kenneth was in Brighton doing a tour of different Fringe festivals, and the director of the Fringe wanted to take the Nigerian delegation to the Marlborough, this venue that is known for doing queer work. And I wasn't sure how to broach the conversation about queerness in Nigeria. Didn't want to be offensive. Didn't know if it was a conversation that people felt comfortable having. So luckily we had more than 15 minutes to talk, and we did go. We went in. After a little while. You went in, didn't we? And then we did have. From what I remember, the conversation was that it would be really hard to stage anything with LGBT people, but the drop was put there. Like this, the question was put there. The question happened, and then it transpired that the work did actually come. So, I just kind of want to advocate for speaking up. And I had no idea that would happen. I just thought I was just chatting away in my pub, So I think we have a lot more power, often than we think we do as marginalised or diverse voices. And speak up. Grab the mic.
Right, does anyone want the mic? Right. Then from the table as well, how do we disrupt the status quo on issues like diversity? What suggestions do you have, again, to policymakers, to practitioners, perhaps sitting in the audience? What do you do to disrupt? How do we move the margins to the center and vice versa?
I want to hear from a strong black woman, because I often feel we don't hear enough from black women. But at some point, please, because I know there's so much wisdom.
No, I just want to say, maybe for my case, as a woman having children and working with people who has children too and being a woman and trying to promote little heard voices in public space and private space, we choose with who we will work, who can meet our needs. So it's a bit like we have to feel confident about what we want, and if we choose the people we want to work with who will meet your need, that you know you're not going to meet their needs. It's hard sometimes because you have to say no to things, but also it makes you more just true, and maybe make people question the way they work. So, for example, we choose to only represent women and non-binary artists. We work usually only with women and non-binary producers, sound technicians. If a festival doesn't meet the needs, we just say no, which gives us power. Sometimes we broke and poor, but also we still keep, our line of engagement with what we represent. So I think it's really important to stay on your position and not being down low by what people say or that you missed an opportunity or something, as far as you can be sure about what you want and what you represent. Hopefully it will change the mentality.
Oh, goodness. Speaking in public is a thing, guys. I think how we begin to change things, maybe also shifting where these conversations happen, It's nice for us to be sitting here at this planetarium as these very articulate human beings. But I also feel like there are plenty of people who may not necessarily have a great command of the language and don't have as much access to these kind of spaces. How do we take the conversations to the rest of the world? Because this is a very exclusive space, and I think that's something that we also need to constantly remind ourselves of in our discussions of diversity. This is an exclusive space. How do we open it up to everybody? And how do we speak in a way that everybody can understand? Because some of the words we use are great. They're $10 words, and sometimes we need $2 words, Yes, I think that is a simple way of beginning to open up the diversity.
Part of that, I think, is also acknowledging why we do it. And I think you said it briefly in terms of just voicing something. But if you really acknowledge the truth of why one is working in this way and what it means, it's almost the acknowledgement of what I personally get from it and what that relationship is to others. So working in a diverse way is a big, complex way of thinking about it. But working in that way is a very strong reflection for myself on a journey that I'm on. And if we start to make it personal and we acknowledge the personality within the work we're doing, then I think you attract like-minded individuals and you change your language based on the dialogue that you want to have. And last night I was on this stage here dancing. I'm not a dancer, but I had a dancer opposite me who provoked me to dance. And suddenly I had to change the language that I use. And for me, that was my acknowledgement of the fact that I'm actually in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong language. And I have to change that in order to accept the dialogue that I want to have. And so I just think that personal investment that we make as creatives, whether you're writing policy or whether you're performing on stage, you still are in a space where you have the ability to acknowledge that your language might be the wrong one, or might not the wrong one. It's just one language, and you have to find the way of communicating it. And so I just think that personal investment is a really important one to acknowledge and to also applaud yourself for taking that leap, and then asking the other person to take the leap with you. And I know that's a very personal thing, and it's a very hard thing, and it's a very vulnerable thing. But without that, why do we do this work? You know, and I think that's maybe something to just always keep in the back of our heads, that we are individuals with emotions and personalities and questions and complexities.
Thank you. I'm very influenced by a theory called border thinking, and I think it came from a theorist called Walter Mignolo. And we are talking about peripheries and centers, and we're saying decentering, so there's various centers. So none of us are the center. We're always bordering with someone else. And I found that it's useful to think of frameworks and really think, who am I targeting? Which borders does my work interface with? And because you're not the center of everything, and you might be off-center, but bordering with 3 or 4 other communities, and then create a framework in which dialogues can happen in different spaces. So, for example, if this festival is interfacing or bordering with another kind of festival, you can have also a long table there as well, so that the people who are not at the center of your activity, but bordering with your activity, you can talk across. And I'm finding that this is quite interesting to create, to generate information very quickly. Like Hassan was saying, why do we have to take a long time? Why does a dancer have to dance for 10 years, then train for 10 years before they can write the story of their life, you know, in a university context? Why can't we make a academic framework into which people can be non-academics and insert their narratives and then publish the book? Someone in London has just done that. She's created an academic book full of narratives by non-academics, but she's wrapped it in a framework that can allow it to exist in various spaces. So it now works as a general readership book, but also as an academic book. So I would say frameworks, when we are organizing something, develop frameworks which allow our information to flow and allow various conversations to happen. I also just want to say one more thing. Me, Kenneth, and Natalie had a spontaneous short table after the pitching center. We had the speed dating organized by PACE, and then me and Natalie and Kenneth sat down and said, we call this the short table, and we discussed some ideas for a project. And it could be that people can create spontaneous short tables around the festival and feedback at some long table later on. So maybe diverse conversations that take place in different places that people think are a good idea and they want more people to hear. They could feedback to a longer table later on.
I think the centre, particularly in Australia, is really bored by its own conversations. And one of the great things that we did a few months ago was partner with the State Theatre Centre of Western Australia and the Perth International Arts Festival, and co-produce a play written and performed by young people with Down syndrome. And they really wanted to get out a conversation around the increasing trend in Australia to sterilise, sort of terminate if there's a child with Down syndrome detected, and also the sort of history of sterilisation of people with Down syndrome in Australia. And it was fantastic for me to sit behind some of the wealthiest people in my city and some of the, I guess, the controllers of our culture, and watch them cry and so deeply engage with this new direct conversation from a community that they have nothing to do with and they know nothing about, and to get that disability politic out into the mainstream. And I think partnering with the mainstream and going into the centre is a really good strategy for all of us working at the edge.
Thanks. I'm going to give an opportunity, questions from the audience. Yes, of course. Okay, then I'd just like to thank everyone at the table. Thank you so much for your contributions today. I'm sure afterwards everyone will be in the foyer, so you can ask them your personal questions there. But I'm going to hand the microphone now to Ricardo, and he's just going to introduce our final speaker for the day.
Rosemary Mangorpe, the CEO of the National Arts Council of South Africa. There's a tradition that we have at this event where she just comes and gives up a little bit of an overview and closes the kind of event on behalf of the PIAD. So Rosemary, thank you very much for keeping the tradition alive. Because last year I forgot and she reminded me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, I'd like to start with the notion of whether we're creating appropriate spaces and speaking the language that will actually take us to where we need to be. And I'd like to say that, you know, life is very complex and life is layered. And we do need to create spaces at every turn. I've discovered through my lived experience that to do what you've done, which is to also frame things in an academic form, actually does generate resources. And publicizing and having publications that can speak to posterity, but in particular to document what is being done and said is very critical. And partly why a lot of our indigenous art forms and indigenous knowledge and indigenous systems don't seem to be growing legs is precisely because we do not document. So I think it's very important to begin to partner. So collaborations are very important. In fact, they are the language of the day. And I would be remiss if I left this platform without congratulating Nike Jonah. And I'd like you to stand. I really would like you to stand. I'd like you to take a bow. Thank you, Nike. And the next person would be Evan Moss. Where is he? Is he here? Please stand. Take a bow. Ricardo Peach, please stand. Take a bow. The reason why it's so important to do this is that the entire conversation of this long table has been about what these four people have been able to do. These three people have been able to do. Now, the reason I guess where there's a tradition is that I aspire for the National Arts Council of Southern Africa to truly be a lead council in demonstrating what multidisciplinarity could be, what the intersection between science, technology, and the arts can be, but in particular, what Africa can become. And I'm privileged to have the platform of IFACA, which is the International Federation of Arts Councils and Culture Agencies, as a space where we can actually also begin to navigate this. In fact, PACE was born out of IFACA, one of those kinds of, and we do need these platforms to inspire. We need to get these kinds of gathering. And you know, last night in your performance in your studio, you mentioned the fact that this is a planetarium. And how many people actually get access to a planetarium? And we had a group of artists, young children from a school that actually had so much fun. I wrote to you, I sent you an SMS yesterday to say that I actually noticed that they were having fun. And it is about beginning to open up those spaces. Now, what is important in the South African context is that we are a nascent democracy and we would like to become everything to everyone globally. And this actually puts pressures in terms of what kind of narratives we're able to create ourselves, develop, a la the, what is this dance thing that Hussein was talking about? Gem? Grime, a la grime, thank you. Because when you create in the periphery, you don't have the pressure. And the less recognized you are, the more relaxed you are in order to actually articulate your art form. So we have that kind of environment in South Africa, and we need to allow it to grow. Now, you've done it, you know, with the Makwanda Republic. And I'm really proud of what you've become because, I mean, when was it? 3 years ago when I met you first? And it was sounding like a dream. But the more people can emulate your example and the more you can share your story, this is happening in a rural village. And it's now attracting people that want to come. So it's also placing the sense of agency on ourselves and not on entities, institutions, and governments to actually do stuff. we need to take back the power of being ourselves. I mean, it wasn't easy for PACE to become. Nika is probably bordering on a nervous breakdown right now. But people came, and things have started. And yesterday I was in a kumbi with young people that were saying, but we didn't know about this. Why didn't you tell us about it? So I'm anticipating that it'll grow and grow and grow, but it starts from you. It starts from ourselves, taking back the sense of agency. And nobody owes us anything, guys. Seriously. Nobody owes you anything in the world. Take your space, occupy it, and do it well. And we look forward to PIAD growing more and more, because there have been some phenomenal things that have happened here. The allosphere, for example, I don't think we've talked enough about the allosphere. And I was saying last night that I'm very concerned about what I call throwaway theater or throwaway initiatives. Like, you have the allosphere, we did it once, and then what? You know, we have these kinds of the onesie? Yeah, Onesie World, and then it happened once, and then it died. This year we've had the radio, it's happening, and then what? I mean, if people get to understand the power of the airwaves, it gives us the freedom to be borderless, the freedom for our work to actually be anywhere in the world. Equally with technology, we can actually leapfrog. We can cut across borders. We can even cut across any kind of regulatory frameworks. We say what we say. You know, I mean, whether it's banned in Nigeria or not, people do know that those people exist, and there are people like us, and they're good people, and they're actually very creative people, and they're actually one of the nicest people that you can ever be with. So what I'm saying is, through these kinds of activities, it takes each one of us to actually amplify what we do, each in our corners, the way we can, and we can actually get this movement going, and we can cause a revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. And then I just also would like to thank Angela de Jesus and Monet Kleinans and the team who put all this together. No one ever acknowledged. Stand up, Angela, where are you? Yay! She's in the back. And she has a 3-month-old son, 4 months. I don't know how you do it. Thank you very much. And that's the end. So there's a bus that's going to take the Open Lab people to Hofmann Square. So hop on your bus and go to Hofmann Square, and other people just gather around here, and we'll talk to you about what happens afterwards. Thank you.